Welcome to the Cross-Cultural Psych Podcast with Professor Paul Youngbin Kim. This podcast features conversations on the intersection of psychology, culture, and faith with renowned scholars in psychology and related fields. And now, here is Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim.
All right, David. I have several questions about teaching. And so the first question is regarding your experience in teaching in Korea. So you've taught students in Korea about Korea for a long time. And I think from your bio, I can gather that it's been a couple of decades. Is that right?
Just short of a couple of decades, yeah. It's coming up to 18 and a half years.
And then that means that you've experienced perhaps a wide range of things, including the rewards and challenges of teaching abroad, but also teaching in Korea as a non-Korean. And so I'm curious, what are some challenges that you might face teaching in Korea, about Korea, to Korean students? And then how do you navigate those challenges?
It's a fantastic question, and I've thoroughly enjoyed my time living and working here. That's why I stay here in Korea, because it's just such a marvelous place, and there is a big focus on education for those that do teach, whether it's a high school teacher or a university professor like myself. If somebody finds out you're a teacher or a professor in Korea, their demeanor kind of automatically changes. They'll suddenly step back and say, "Oh, 교수님, 성태님," and bow at you. There's a certain level of respect for teachers and education that is not found in all cultures. We all value things differently. And so it's a rewarding job, perhaps not always financially, but at least in terms of social reputation. One of the big challenges that I found coming here was challenging my own ethnocentrism, wanting to see Korea through the lens with which I grew up with in the south of England and Australia. I was very fortunate to grow up with good schools and good education. But when I came over here, I had a certain view of the world, and I projected that view onto Korea. And so I was often seeing Korean politics, Korean history, relationships between Korea and Japan, all of these things. I was seeing it through primarily a Western or a European view. And some of the things that I would experience, they wouldn't make sense to me. I would watch the movies, or I would see Korean attitudes towards history, towards appearance and lookism, and they wouldn't make sense to me. And I would initially, I think because I was young, I was confident, and I had what some people describe as main character syndrome. It's very easy coming to Korea, and especially if you're a teacher and you've got like 50 people in the lecture hall looking at you, you can feel very much like the main character of a movie. And one of the big challenges I had initially was to first counter my ethnocentrism, and in doing so, try to see Korea as Korean people see Korea. Now, that's a very, very difficult, and maybe perhaps some people even might say an arrogant thing to try to do. But it was important to me to learn to see Korea as it is, rather than Korea as I want it to be, or what made sense to me. So I had to challenge a lot of my assumptions, my prejudices, and finally see Korea for what it was. The other one that I had to do while doing that is, avoid trying to be the main character, and to listen to Korean people tell their story, and to take it for what it was. That's hard when you're young. I think with age, and the more I studied, the more I went through graduate school and these things, that I learnt that humility. And I'm glad that these challenges, although they were difficult, they were very rewarding, and they produced great fruits for me personally and professionally in coming to understand Korea as Korean people see it, as much as that is possible.
That's really well put. And I really like the emphasis on cultural humility, David, that you talked about, right? And how over time, that's something that you just saw as really important in terms of understanding Korea. I don't want to put you on the spot, but is there an example that readily comes to mind that initially you had difficulty sort of appreciating about Korea or accepting about Korea, where maybe because of ethnocentrism, you had some trouble understanding a certain aspect of Korea?
Yeah, so many. Let me try to run through perhaps three very quickly that might illuminate different aspects of this. The first would be perhaps in terms of geopolitics or history. Now, relationships between Korea and Japan are a very sensitive issue here. Now, in some parts of the world, the sensitive issue might be race. In other parts of the world, the central issue might be religion. Where I'm from in the United Kingdom, we have this great affinity with the idea of class. Here in South Korea, one of the things has been history, the colonization of the Korean peninsula from 1910 to 1945 by Japan, and the subsequent relations. Now, coming here, it was very easy for me to say, come on, look what we did in Europe. We tore each other apart in the millions, and now we're all friends. Now we all hold hands. Now we've moved on. Why can't you do that? Look at the relationships. And I held that position a lot, but it didn't go across very well to Korean people. They didn't see it like that. And they found that position almost somewhat offensive. It didn't take me to read the history books to learn this, because I read all the history books. And what it took me to do was to listen to the Korean people tell their story and listen to how they felt, to try to empathize with their perspective. It wasn't so much, it didn't require rationality. It didn't require academic publishing or book learning. It required this idea that I might be wrong here and they might be right. And so that was one thing that I learned, that just because I have this view of history doesn't mean it will be shared or should be shared by Korean people. So I learned to understand that with this concept of intergenerational trauma, the memory that goes on, and also this national narrative. So that was one very important one. To run through two more very quickly, one would be in terms of lookism. Now, beauty standards are very high and strong in Korea. They have a term, 외모지 상주의. And I grew up learning that don't judge a book by its cover. I grew up watching Beauty and the Beast and Shrek and all of these stories where you eventually find the person inside. And I believed that, and I still think there's a lot of truth to that. Now, in Korea, the expression don't judge a book by its cover does not exist. You do kind of judge people based on their appearance. In Korea, you're not expected to be beautiful, but you're expected to try. You're expected to try to look good, and it's seen as a sign of virtue, of hard work, and people do place a great emphasis on that. Interestingly, it's sometimes associated with morality, which I find fascinating. Like if older people see a young child do something well, they will immediately respond, oh, yepa. And they will say that's handsome and that's pretty. So there's this subconscious connection between appearance and morality. And that again, like I didn't want to put on face cream. I didn't want to have a shave. When I first came, I looked like a fat Jesus. My hair was down to sort of my rib cage. I had a big beard. I was trying to be Paul McCartney. And, I thought, live and let live. But Korea said, no, in this society, of course, we don't want to be too overbearing, but you look good, not for yourself, but for other people. It's part of a social contract. You're expected to do that. That was a big challenge for me. Very quickly, the third final one. I grew up squaring my shoulders, shaking people's hands, looking them in the eye and speaking my mind when I believe I had something to say. You don't do that in Korea, especially with people older than you, people more senior than you. What you do is you look down, you bow, and you keep your mouth shut. And that was a huge challenge for me. And I had this question of, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, or stick to the values which I grew up with. And I think there's a great sense of meaning to those values. And so I had this existential battle with that, Paul. Like, should I not do what I've been raised to do, or should I adapt here and sort of respect the culture? I eventually learned to find a way to navigate it, and what I generally tend towards is respecting the Korean culture. And so in those three issues, in terms of history and intergenerational trauma, memory, in terms of appearance, and then in terms of relationships with other people, they were all things that I had to completely reimagine and rethink what I held to be true, and then, reshape my understanding.
Great examples. Thank you, David. And I think we will come back to some details of what you shared in a bit, but I also wanted to ask about what in the US, and now I see articles in Korea also referring to this, what we refer to as microaggressions, right? That there are slight or subtle invalidations or insults that are sent to minority groups, foreigners living in a country based on gender, all these things. I'm curious, have you had experiences of microaggressions directed towards you from students, from colleagues, for that matter, from Korean folks? And how have you learned to handle those experiences?
It's a very interesting question because the attitudes between my Korean students and then my North American students towards these things is so vastly different. And putting them together in the same lecture hall sometimes is fascinating for me because people, it's not me, but the students suddenly realize, oh, wow, they do things so differently because now everybody basically dresses the same and they watch the same content online.
Right.
But there are still these wonderful differences. Now, in terms of microaggressions towards myself, I have to say that I've received a lot of what we might call 역차별 or positive discrimination here in Korea. Because of where I'm from, because I'm English, I'm British, maybe because I'm a man, because I'm a white dude. I'm sure I've had many opportunities that wouldn't have been presented to me otherwise. I'm conscious of that. Of course, you could point to something as microaggressions. For example, even if I stumble through a Korean phrase and get things horribly wrong. I work on my language as much as I can. It's not bad. But in the early days, if I stumbled through a phrase and got things horribly wrong, Korean people might still go, oh, wow, you speak Korean so well. Thank you very much. And it's like, but then if there was a Korean American and they got something just slightly wrong in a pronunciation or the emphasis on a syllable, they might be criticized. And so there's this difference. And sometimes, I would feel like, why are you praising me for that? It wasn't very good. I guess that could be perceived as a microaggression, but I think I'm really clutching at straws with this one, Paul, because I don't really think I received much in the way of microaggressions. During my time, I've been told, no foreigners are allowed in here and things like that. And I've received those treatments trying to get into various places, but it's not common. And I don't let those experiences define my view of Korea or the Korean people. One swallow does not a summer make, and I won't generalize across 50 million through one or two negative experiences. We can't control the negative experiences, but we can control how we react to them. And, I'm pretty sure that during my life, I might have not smiled at someone when I walked out of a shop, or I might have been thinking about something so incredibly hard that I didn't really hear somebody when they were talking to me. And so I know I'm certainly fallible. So in terms of microaggressions, I could point to different stories, but I don't feel them. Or at least if I do feel them, I try to turn them into something positive because we're all going through stuff. And so, you said you'd read articles on it. I don't think microaggressions are that big of a thing in South Korea. The lecture halls, the classrooms, they're not as explosive in terms of content or in terms of outrage or in terms of difficulty and sensitivity that's required. And I try to be sensitive to that when I'm teaching international students, and I've had great experiences. But I think these ideas of microaggressions, trigger warnings, cultural appropriation, they don't really occur here as much in South Korea.
Yeah, that's my sense of it too. I'm working with a group of researchers in Korea who, among other things, we are creating a measure of microaggressions experienced by multicultural youths. So I think in Korea, they define multicultural youth in a very specific way, namely one parent who's Korean, another parent who's not Korean, and how they might have experienced as a result of their multiracial identity insults and slights from the Korean community. Again, that's in the beginning phases of our research, but I think it'd be interesting to contrast, depending on your cultural background, like what kinds of microaggressions might come up. When I was Googling the term microaggressions for Korean articles, a couple of articles were actually kind of using the 미세먼지, the fine dust or the microdust metaphor to describe it's like aggression that's all around us, like fine dust or something like that. So it was interesting to see, but not a lot, as you said, which means that in the US we talk about it a lot, but not as much in Korea. Yeah.
You might get a completely different I love the analogy, by the way, to microdust. Maybe my mask is good then. You might get a very different response if you speak to young women. I think in terms of gender, microaggressions might be felt more readily, especially in terms of language or assumptions. So I have had young women speak to me and say that they have felt microaggressions. I know language is changing here. We don't sort of say 교수, 여학생 anymore, like female student or female professor. We just use the more gender neutral terms. So yeah, great. Good luck with your research. And I'm sure in terms of ethnicity and gender, there will be a lot to uncover that's worth listening to.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point about the intersection of ethnicity and gender. Related to that, and also related to what you shared earlier, David, about how Korean society is changing and changing quite rapidly. I always tell my students that Korea is such an interesting blend of contemporary and traditional aspects, right? Not only in what's obvious to the eyes, like buildings and roads, and that in the middle of the city, you have these high-rise apartments and buildings, but also traditional looking gates, right? But also in terms of the subjective culture as well, right? Like values that are rapidly changing, the generational differences that exist between the elderly and the younger folks. And when it comes to topics like, for example, LGBTQ plus issues. So I'm curious, how have you observed that and how have you managed those conversations? Because I know you've written about those things quite a bit as well.
Korea is a wonderful paradox, and everything you can say about Korea, the opposite is also true, because Korea is very conservative, but at the same time, Korea is pretty progressive. Korea is very old, 5,000 years. Korea is also pretty new. I mean, Korean people were only allowed to legally travel abroad from January 1st, 1989. That's not that long ago, Paul. You know, and Korea it's traditional and it's modern.
Yeah.
It's this paradox, and it's all, and also at the same time, I would say it's very cosmopolitan and it's very international, but it's also very nationalistic. Now, these changing values, not everybody is changing their values, but there has been this huge change over the last couple of decades that I've witnessed, and I see it in terms of linguistics. We see the language changing, and this changing language is reflecting what people are observing in society. So, for example, about 7 or 8 years ago, Korean people started using the terms honbap, honggong, honnol, and this means, in reverse syntax, alone eating, alone studying, alone playing, and so on. So this idea of hon culture, alone culture, came in, and it pointed to a growing sense of individualism amongst the people, that they were now comfortable doing things alone, and they were thus creating words to express this, and then a whole economy and culture and society grew out of it. What I took from that is individualism, this idea that you will decide what you want to do, even something as simple as eating lunch, is relatively new in South Korea. It was geared by things like this. You know, resources were changing. So people had greater access to their own room. They had greater access to their own television and content and tablets. And so therefore their behavior changed. And as their behavior changed repeatedly over time, they kept eating alone. Therefore their values changed. So you get this great interplay between, I think these are ideas I got from you, Paul, that I love this way of describing it. As their resources changed, their behavior changed. And when that behavior continually changed over time, so did their values for some people. Now, not everybody's value has changed, because some people will cling to the past and they'll talk about this idea of, you know, if you read a textbook, Paul, it will say Korea is a very collective society and things like this. And I'm not sure that's really true anymore. Korea is a pretty hyper-individualistic society amongst some young people. In terms of gender or LGBT issues, we're very quick to compare it to, say, France or Sweden or the United States and say, look, this is where we are. Why aren't you here right now in 2023? And I feel like that's a very unfair test. And Korea gets a lot of undue hate on these. Now, obviously, Korea does have a long way to go in terms of gender and LGBT issues, but it's definitely going in the right way. You would never say it's going backwards, really. Women's rights in terms of abortion, that came in 2021. The conversation about gay rights and LGBT, that's increasing all the time. Mental health is going up. Women in South Korea now outlive men, outperform them academically, and outnumber them in society. And these are all changing. They're all going in the right way. And I think Korea, it might solve some of these issues more quickly than Western counterparts did. You know, for example, you're from the United States. It took the United States a long time to come to terms with race and gay rights, you know, and it's still going through that process. Korea is relatively young, and the time that it takes Korea to get there might be shorter. So I think we're seeing these changing values, and it reflects a change in Korea's economic resources. People are now looking for abstract values such as justice and equality. They're not just... Korea was poor, wasn't it? I mean, when I first got here, people would still ask me, David, 밥 먹었니? Which translates as something like, David, did you eat?
Right.
And I would answer them like, yeah, I had a sandwich. Like, why? Why am I getting fat again? Like, what are you doing?
Why are you interested? Yeah.
Why are you interested? But when they were saying, have you eaten? It was a way of saying, how are you? It reflected the poverty that certain generations not too far along grew up with. In the 1970s, it was using, you know, newspapers as toilet paper and things like this. It was poor. And all of a sudden, the economy has changed. With the economy changing, we've seen behavior changing, and therefore we've seen values changing. You have to tie in globalization to that. And, you know, it's the students grow up watching the same Insta Reels and TikToks, and they see all of these, but they retain a sense of Koreanness to their values. It's not all of a sudden as if every Korean has adopted Western ideas in terms of feminism, LGBT, or culture or microaggressions. It's unique here, I think, in its way.
And those things get passed down from generation to generation. And even with more resources and values changing, like you mentioned, it takes time, right? And Korea has come a long way, right? I'm curious, you know, you spoke a little bit about this earlier, but in terms of your acculturation to the Korean context, can you say a little bit more about what aspects of acculturation has been most challenging for you? I know you talked about, for example, adapting to, you know, talking to people who are older or in position of authority. That could be one example, but are there other examples where you felt like, oh, this part of acculturation was truly challenging?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about nunchi. By the way, in the last week, I've had this fascinating conversation that I haven't really done it before. Can men and women be friends? Now, for me, this is not a question. It's like, yeah, of course we can. I've got female friends. I've got old friends. I've got young friends. I've got gay friends. I've got straight friends. Really, the identity doesn't matter too much to me. It's like their personality, their character, and I respect them. Now, I did a very rough survey on an online forum amongst predominantly British males. I asked, and 450 people responded. 80% said yes, men and women could be friends. 20% said no. Now, I've done a similar thing in my class, in my lecture halls with Korean people the last week, and it's the other way around. It's like the majority of people are like, no, men and women can't be friends. What are you talking about? There is this divide, and I find that fascinating because there's no, to me, right or wrong answer to this question, because you know, the Korean people, they grow up with Confucianism. They grow up with this concept of byol, which is distinction and separation. And, you know, it might not always resonate in modern democratic individualist societies, but nevertheless, it's there. And the biological differences between men and women are sort of emphasized to an extent in Korea that we don't always see. This is another term in which I've had to sort of, you know, acclimatize to these cultures, these differences in gender. I grew up, this is a very trivial example, and then I'll come to nunchi. I grew up shaking people's hands, and then when I meet, if I meet a woman, if I meet my friend's fiance or wife, I might greet them by kissing them on the cheek or something. There was this, don't do that in South Korea. You're going to get in big trouble very quickly for doing these things. Even just saying hello to someone, you have to change so fundamentally. Now, I said about not speaking to elders or waiting your turn to address people. The flip side of that is I'm often now the oldest. I'm often the oldest in the lecture hall. Or the most senior in position, and that requires actually me to lead. And sometimes I'm an introvert, and sometimes I just want to go with the flow, and sometimes I don't want to be a dominating presence in a room because I'm a little bit introverted sometimes, and I like just to be quiet, and I like the sound of my own company and things like this. But the flip side of this is that sometimes you have to be quiet when elders are speaking, but when you are the elder, sometimes you have to lead, and you're expected to do that. Students will look to you for guidance. The relationship between a professor and a student in South Korea is a little bit different. They expect to be guided. They expect to be told what to do. That's been very interesting for me. In terms of nunchi, let's just explain that very quickly. This high context communication, there's nothing said in Korean society. Nothing is said, but everything is communicated. And I will go to ancestor worship ceremonies, or I'll go to a graduation ceremony for professors and students. I might go to a meeting at the Ministry of Justice, and you just have to open your eyes, turn on your consciousness, and look what everybody's doing and just go with that. You're not meant to do what you want to do. You're not meant to do what's expected. You're meant to do what everybody else is doing. And if you can do that, then you can be quite successful in Korean society, because they will tell you about rules, but they change in every situation. And it's sometimes a case of just following what the first person does, and following the leader, following the oldest person.
Yeah.
And that's the nunchi for you. That does pose challenges for people. I might get my language wrong, but on your TikTok, there's lots of people saying that they have autism or they're on various spectrums, and that Korean society would be very, very difficult for those kinds of people.
Yeah, because part of the feature or the distinguishing factor about those conditions would be the inability to pick up on social cues, right? Or the difficulty in picking up on social cues.
You have to pick up on social cues pretty quickly here. It's expected of you, I think, in South Korea. Although I will say the society is pretty much, depends who you are, but it's quite forgiving. I mean, it's not a brutal society in that aspect. I think for a lot of people, we see Korea, especially if you don't come or live in Korea, it'll either be a K-pop wonderland where everybody is handsome and beautiful, or it might be a dystopian hell where everything is Squid Game and all of these things. These are the two images of Korea that resonate so effectively outside of Korea. But inside of Korea, inside of Korea, it's the invisible stuff that makes it real. It's the stuff that 10 million people go around Seoul. The subway's clean, cheap, and nothing happens. That's the beauty of Korea. I invented this term, Paul, called maum spacing. And this is for a type of behavior that fascinates me. In South Korea, you go to a coffee shop, you put down your $1,000, right, whatever it might be, you put down your stuff, and then you stand up and you go and order a coffee, and you walk outside to have a smoke or a vape, and then you make a phone call and you come back and your stuff is just still there. This is my space. You don't need to worry about things as much in Korea. There's this sense that the convenience stores are unmanned. There's nobody working in them. You go in, you get your own stuff, you scan it, you put your card in, and you leave. There's cameras, but there's nobody in there watching. And stores will leave their produce and products outside, like the alcohol and things like that.
Yeah.
And nobody steals it.
Right.
That's amazing. But nobody talks about it.
Yeah. I mean, like you said, there might be some structural elements that are contributing to that, like cameras, right? But also culturally, even before cameras, I think there was a sense where, maybe there was moral things that contributed to those behaviors of stealing being uncommon. Yeah.
It's not to say Korean people are perfect or virtuous,
Right.
or that's not the point, but I'm saying that experience is real. You've probably experienced it, that you can leave your stuff on a table and walk away. And the idea that someone's going to come and take your stuff doesn't really cross your mind. And that's such a wonderful thing to have in society, that not always clutching for your possessions.
Right. That people use their cell phones to save seats, right? In public spaces. Yeah.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
Brand new cell phones. There it is. Walk away.
My students, my American students often comment on how safe they felt walking late at night in the middle of a major city like Seoul, which is very different kind of experience compared to walking in a big city like Seattle at a certain time, right? So we just have different ways of, I guess, enjoying the nightlife in a place like Seattle compared to in a place like Seoul.
There's very little gang violence. There's very little drug use here in South Korea. Antisocial behavior. You're absolutely right. You don't have to worry about where you walk. There's no dangerous alleys. And again, is this because Korean people are more virtuous? No, I think there's these structural things. For example, if you ask a Korean person, do you want to go and smoke a joint or something? They will say, I can't. I've got to go to math class. Do you want to join a gang? They're like, no, I've got to go to violin academy, then English academy. They're busy, right? Korean youth are busy, and their schedules are lined up with academies and institutions and things like this. So I don't think it's necessarily that these people are more virtuous or better morally. It's not about that. But there's these structural things in place that mean society is very, very safe.
Yeah, thank you for those examples of how you've acculturated to the Korean context. David, you mentioned nunchi, and I wanted to quickly follow up on that because I think the examples that you gave all illustrate sort of what I've been trying to emphasize when it comes to nunchi, which is not always, but many times in Korean society, nunchi is a way for someone who has less power in a situation to figure out what the others with more power want, right? So for example, the employee trying to figure out what their boss wants in this particular situation, or a student trying to figure out what a professor wants. So I often find that nunchi is a way for those who maybe have less resources, less privilege than in a situation to try to understand those with more power, more resources. So I find it refreshing then whenever those in power exercise nun or try to intentionally have nunchi for those with less power, like professors, for example, trying to be more attuned to the students and using nunchi to be able to connect with students better. So just wanted to, I guess, comment on that. In Korean, you might have heard of this phrase, but they talk about like eating nunchi rice or nunchi bap, right? Where employees are so stressed because they're trying to navigate, and it feels like walking on eggshells, right? The corporate culture, right? In a way that illustrates that element.
Yeah. And you're right to say that I think elderly people or those with power now are expected to utilize nunchi to help the lives of those below them or the people they're teaching or things like this. That it's this emotional intelligence, the opposite word, which would be like a boomer or a Karen, this type of thing, would be a gonde. Now, a gonde in South Korea that has no nunchi, that just does what they want, and because of their position of power or authority, people can't really challenge them and push back to them. And so nunchi is about recognizing the other. You know, in South Korea, a lot of the time I'm no longer David. This is a fabulous thing about identity in the self, that, you know, many of my friends, I'd never use their name. Like, I can call you Paul. That's okay. But if we were in Korean, we probably wouldn't be using each other's names. At least in terms of age or position, we would have to work that out,
right?
And how these things go. My sister-in-law, my brother-in-law, who I have fabulous relations with, and they're 2-3 years older than me. If I say their name, like their actual name, I say it now, Kim Eun-young and Ishibek. If I were to say that to them, just say, hey, Eun-young. she would look at me and as if to say I'd committed a grave affront.
Right.
This idea of identity changes. So you're using nunchi to manage, well, I'm not David. My identity is flexible. Here, I'm a dongseng. I'm a younger person. Here, I'm a professor. Here, I'm an uncle. Here, I'm just nobody. Just sit and shut up and don't draw attention to yourself. Here, I'm everybody in the room. You're using nunchi to navigate that flexible identity. I mean, when I grew up, I had to read To Kill a Mockingbird at schools, and there was that line about Atticus Finch that he is the same in his backyard as he is in society, that there was a steadfastness and a consistency to the character and identity, and that's not necessarily here at all. And so you're using nunchi to navigate these things. Now, I just need to say this about nunchi, that some people on the TikTok that I made about your description of it, they immediately went, that's emotional intelligence. That's what that is. And there's this line in anthropology that you should find the strange in the familiar and the familiar in the strange. And there is something very familiar about nunchi, but it's not exact. You need to find the strange thing about it because it resonates differently here, just as everything else does. Some people, there have been books written about nunchi calling it the secret to happiness. Some people find nunchi very oppressive. Some people find nunchi a iron belt that constricts their behavior, their appearance. They will say, I wanted to do it. 하지만 눈치를 봤다. I was looking at nunchi. So it can be a source of strength, harmony, and it can also be very, constraining and restrictive to people. It's everything, but it's so important here.
I really appreciate that point. And I'm going to jot down that quote because I've been getting a lot of questions about nunchi, but also Han and Jung. And I think, David, you asked about Han before too, whether is that a Korea specific construct or can it generalize to other cultures, right? Or is Han just language specific to Korea? Or is it an idea that is very unique to Korea? And I think I've been arguing or trying to argue that it's something unique to Korea because of these sort of multidimensional elements, right? That something that's positive can also become so negative in a different context, right? Or something that's a solution can also be a source of problem as well, right? That nunchi can both be a source of pain, but also can bring healing and interpersonal relationships. So really appreciate that quote and the points that you're making.
You will know this quote as well, but I think this is so true. Korean people are in some aspects like all others, like some others, and like no others. So there are some things that all Koreans have in common.
Yeah.
There are some things that some Koreans have in common, and there are some things that that's only one Korean, that's their individual personality. So I think sometimes when we do talk about Korean culture, or we talk about these nunchi, or we can talk about Han and other things, that we need to sometimes be aware that there are some things that all Koreans share. And this might be language, this might be bowing. There are some things that only some Koreans share, and there are some things that are just individual, idiosyncratic peccadillos or personalities.
Yeah, good point.
Can I just say one thing about Han very quickly? I took my 17-year-old nephew to one of my lectures last Friday, just because schedules required of it. And there's a room of 50 international students, and my 17-year-old nephew, he's full Korean. He's lived here his entire life. His name is Lee Dong-hyun. And he's a very brave young man. And I asked him towards the end to address the whole class and say, does Han exist for your generation? Or is it something that only appears in exam questions when you have to study literature and poems? And he addressed the whole class and he said, we don't have Han in my generation. We have Insta stories, and we have flex, and we have swag, and we have oversized t-shirts, and we have lo-fi music with a lot of reverb on the vocals. We have Doja Cat and things like this. But Han is something we have to write about when we take an exam, but we don't feel Han. Now that was one young gentleman, but he sees Han as a remnant perhaps of the past, or something imposed on him by an older generation. Now, we cannot generalize that across the whole population. And, his attitudes might change as he grows up. But for him, and he's about to do his SATs, Han doesn't exist.
Wow, that's fascinating. I mean, like you said, his views might change as he develops further, but as a high school student, he has an academic understanding of it, but not necessarily a felt understanding of it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if that's one of those things that eventually in Korean society, it won't be the felt aspect of Han, but rather everyone just understands it as a thing of the past. And to me, that seems like almost something that needs to be grieved, right? That's sad, that would be lost, because I view Han as a really valuable thing, but simultaneously, of course, a painful thing.
And I agree with all of those. I'm very respectful and sensitive of them. Just while we're talking, though, let's have another perspective, which is not to say this is 100% true, but in a sense, it might also be gaslighting the youth. No, you're Korean. You're meant to be sad. You're meant to feel trauma. You're meant to experience what we experienced. And, sometimes people might be saying, yeah, but I'm all right.
Right.
Look what we live in. I've got 5G, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, Netflix, everything's going on. Where is my intergenerational trauma? And this is not to say that those feelings aren't real, but it's, the youth want to define their own values. That's what makes young people young.
Right.
They define themselves in opposition to generations that have come before. And Han is normally used to emphasize tense relations between Korea and Japan. You can get into the academic study and say that Han was a construct created by the Japanese to, create a sense of false consciousness in the Marxist sense of the Korean people, to keep them down. But nevertheless, cultural relations between Korea and Japan are at their highest. Right? Japanese animation movies are dominating the cinema, Korean K-pop over in Japan. The young people they're interacting differently. Of course, history matters, politics matters, but maybe Han might just be for the books. I'm not sure.
I always wanted to, David, ask you about K-pop and Korean dramas and Korean entertainment, because I know this is something that also that you have written about. And I certainly am not like an expert in those areas, but I'm fascinated by sort of the explosion of Korean entertainment. And it truly feels like we're living in an era where Korean entertainment is truly central and not peripheral or marginalized, where in the US, people are talking about Korean entertainment. International students are going to Korea because of Korean entertainment. I guess it's a broad question, but how do you feel about that type of an explosion? What are the rewards and the potential downsides of that?
Yeah. I feel it's a fantastic question. I feel proud. Here's a really interesting thing that I mentioned already, that I'm from Britain. And if Adele or Ed Sheeran or somebody like that, if they get a #1 or a Billboard or a Grammy, I don't feel this sense of, yes, go England, go Britain. There's not that sense of collective achievement. But in South Korea, these achievements are felt when Bong Joon-ho and Parasite wins the Oscars, when BTS, now 50/50 or Blackpink, NCT 17, when these groups, Son Heung-min in the football, when they achieve something, the nation feels it. Now, let's go back to some people around me of my generation in their 40s. I might ask, what do you think of BTS, as a trite example, because they're always in the press. And the Korean 40-year-old might say to me, I don't really know any BTS songs. I can't name any of the members, but I love them.
Yeah.
I love them because what they're doing for our country. Now, in Korea, celebrities are given the term daepyo. Now, daepyo means representative. So these people, whether they're pop stars, drama stars, sports stars, movie stars, when they go onto the world stage, they're not representing themselves.
Right.
They're carrying 50 million people, the reputation of Korea. And you can feel that here, that this is national achievements, this is national success. And in doing so, these people are representing Korea to the world. For the longest time, the most famous Korean was always a North Korean. It was Kim Jong-il, or it was Chairman Kim Jong-un. If you went around the world and asked 7 billion people, about Korea, their minds might have immediately raced to missiles, nuclear, scary stuff, even just some kind of vague, ambiguous, weird, semi-communist figure that's mocked in light entertainment. South Korea's Hallyu, this K-wave with the dramas, the cosmetics, the webtoons, the literature, that has given South Korean people ownership of the narrative again. It's giving them identity, and it's made them be heard in the international world for their own achievements, and that's so very important to them.
Mm-hmm.
It's not new for Korean people or Asian people. Like Hallyu, Korean movies, Korean dramas, and K-pop has been huge in Asia for like 20 years, if not more. So what you need to understand is that Korean people have been developing these dramas and this music
Right.
since around sort of 1992. You get Soteji coming out with, in 1992, you get dramas like Winter Sonata a few years later. They've been developing this industry with huge focus on Asia. And it's been super popular here. Now we're in the fourth generation of K-pop. Now we're in Netflix K-dramas, and the standard is so high. The quality is so high because they've been doing this for so long. And the West, or the rest of the world, they're getting their first taste of K-pop and K-dramas when the standard is so high. And it's around this time that Korean people themselves are getting a bit bored of it, actually. So you mentioned the international students. It's 100% real. They come to my lectures and they know all the groups, they know all the songs, they know all the history, and they're on it. And the Korean people are looking at them going, what about Taylor Swift? Like, what's going it's the Korean people have sort of gotten over it now because they've seen it for so long. It's become a little bit blasé for them, you know? Whereas the rest of the world is getting that first exquisite experience of it when the standards are so high. And we say the first cut is the deepest, but it's having such a profound and real effect. Young people around the world are touched by K-pop and K-dramas. Now, I try to point to three things. I'll see if I can make this point very quickly about K-pop. This is, why is K-pop so popular? Why do so many people love it? For some people, K-pop is like an empty Rorschach test in which you can project whatever you want. Some people love K-pop because it helps them come to terms with their own ethnic identity. We live in a world now where your identity in terms of ethnicity is meant to be understood. I grew up with all my professors and masters telling me you should be colorblind. It was a very different world, right? And now we need to be conscious of it. So K-pop in terms of ethnicity offers like a third way or a new path. It offers something non-white. It offers something non-Western. And a lot of people resonate with that. In terms of middle class values, K-pop is not about sex, drugs, and violence and WAPs and all of those kind of things. You can listen to K-pop with your mum or your auntie and no problem. A lot of K-pop fans are from Southeast Asia and they wear headscarves and they're Muslim and they still love it. So K-pop communicates with them. And finally, K-pop is huge amongst the LGBT community. And there's a lot of people, because it has different representations of soft masculinity and yassification and girl boss, that kind of thing. It has all of these different representations. And so it reaches so many different people,
right?
K-pop and the K-dramas. And that's a beautiful thing because it provides a sense of community, a sense of comfort, a sense of togetherness. And it seems to be, whether you like the music or the dramas or not, it seems to be a source of good for the world and for people.
Wow. I could listen to that all day, David. Thank you for those insightful comments. I agree with sort of the pride aspect of it, meaning as a Korean American, it's really neat to see my own American students so engaged in what's happening in the Korean entertainment world. I'm also curious, so now I'm speaking as a psychologist, K-pop, especially sort of this hypersexualization of young girls, right? That we see, or I think we saw more, maybe not as strongly now, but a lot of, sexualization in a very blatant way that made me feel uncomfortable. Do you have any insights or critiques around that? Like, why did we need to do that in K-pop in a way that kind of fed into this narrative of Asian fetish and those kinds of things?
It's a very good question. There was the big thing around the group New Jeans with their song Cookie and Negamanden Cookie, particularly because of the age of the performers. I mean, sometimes we're very quick to celebrate other things in the West. So I was asked to speak in the international media about the New Jeans song Cookie. And I made the suggestion that if this was a song written and performed by a 15-year-old Swedish artist, people might be celebrating her sexual agency, her maturity and things like that. But when it's K-pop, we're very quick to suggest that this is exploitation, this is fetishization, there's a Lolita complex going on. And these are all very important arguments that I'm cognizant of. I think what we're seeing at the moment is that K-pop is going two ways. The men are becoming softer. Soft masculinity is defining a lot of K-pop at the moment. By this, I mean androgynous presentation. I mean the use of makeup, very thin bodies, very coquettish behavior from the men rather than a hypermasculinity. At the same time, we're seeing amongst the girl groups a lot of this sort of, it's becoming less sexualized. It's becoming more girl crush syndrome, where it looks a bit like the girl next door. It looks a little bit more casual. And so I think K-pop is always sort of changing with the times. It's reflecting these. It's really interesting to me. Is the West, or is the international community, is it ready to accept a singular Korean artists, or does it always have to be groups? Like, are we ready to take it? Because when you look at the data, if you look at Stray Kids, if you look at Blackpink, if you look at ATEEZ or IVE, or all of the majority of their views come from abroad. They're huge abroad. If you look at IU, if you look at Park Hyo-shin, all Korea.
Wow.
Inside Korea, single solo artists that sing ballads or sing songs are super popular. But outside, it's the groups. Is the international community ready to accept an individual Korean artist? Or do we it always has to be the groups? There's this kind of subconscious need for this multi-performance, going on. Are we ready to accept like hyper-masculine Korean male performers as well? Because a lot of the Korean guys I teach, they've done 2 years in the military. They're built, they've got six packs, they're ripped, they're like really strong guys, is the West ready to accept sort of hyper masculine sexualized men, or does it have to be, no, you can be the soft stuff, you can wear the makeup and the androgyny and the colored hair, but you can't be hypersexualized in that way. So sometimes I wonder how much of it comes from the K-pop industry's creation of these concepts, and how much comes from the international community's unconscious or subconscious expectations of what Korean people should be. Soft, unsexualized in the male performance and in groups as well, collective. So I wonder how much of that is K-pop and how much of that is the international community's unconscious expectations.
Yeah, no, I think that's fascinating insight, David, into, are there stereotypes of Asians and Asian Americans that might feed into like putting K-pop stars in certain boxes, right? Like, I mean, you mentioned you can be a certain body type, but not this other body type, right? Or it could be a group, but not a solo artist, those kinds of things. Yeah.
It might change over time. Also, I guess there's a Marxist economic analysis in terms of the West doesn't do groups anymore, really.
Right.
It's just, well, we'll do the solo artist and you do the groups. And so they've sort of split the production of this music across, right?
Right.
I grew up with NSYNC and Spice Girls and, Eternal and Backstreet Boys. The West doesn't produce many groups anymore, at least not that dominate the top of the charts. The groups come from the East.
Right. Interesting. David, I just have a couple of wrap-up questions. So do you have any advice for non-Koreans who are interested in living and perhaps teaching in Korea? So people who will come after you in their, I guess, vocational search to live in Korea and to teach. Do you have any advice for them?
Come. First of all, I would encourage anybody to do it. Korea has been so good for me. I think I started off this conversation by saying a lot of things that I would just repeat and reiterate now, which would be to try to see Korea as it is rather than as you want it to be, to avoid the main character syndrome. Now, what Korea has been really good for me is in terms of that I had a deal of confidence. I had a deal of, sense of identity. I had a deal of, arrogance at some point. And I had these qualities, but what Korea gave me was it gave me the things that I didn't have. It filled in these aspects of humility and relationships and hard work. You know, Korea expects a lot of you, actually. So my days are filled from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m., 11 p.m. And I love it, actually. It's for me. I'm not going to say that this is for everyone, but Korea asks a lot of you. Korea requires a lot. And if you like that, it's going to be fabulous for you. It's going to transform you. It's going to help you become who you might be able to become. It's going to have a very profound effect, but it's not easy and it's not for everyone. You know, Korea is a hardworking society. It's incredibly competitive, and it's because it's hardworking, and it's because it's competitive, and it's because it requires a lot of its citizens and the people that live here, that it's risen from devastation and poverty and hunger in the space of a few decades, right? In half a century. Gangnam used to be mud, and now it's a symbol of affluence and sophistication that's recognized the world over. That didn't happen just because of positive vibes and everybody thinking positively. That happened because it requires a lot. And if you do come to Korea, don't come expecting that Korea should change towards you. Korea is not here to accommodate everyone. It is accommodating, but it requires that you accommodate towards Korea in some ways. And there'll be many things that you find that are not quite in line with how you think. But I believe I've not invented this term, but I've popularized it. I searched it, and if you go to Wikipedia, it was my photo that came up. Koreanization. We speak a lot about westernization. We speak a lot about modernization. We speak a lot about globalization. And Koreanization is that you allow yourself to become Koreanized in some way. Now, this might be in the way that you style your hair. This might be the way in which you sit on the subway, the way in which you talk to elders, or you go back to your own country and you start bowing at people.
You're right.
Yeah, it happens. But allow yourself to become Koreanized in some way will really benefit your stay here. The last point about if people are going to come here or not, you will finally understand your own culture so much better as well. People say it to me all the time, and I experienced it too. My international students, they come here, they're not just learning Korean culture, but it's like if you ask a fish in water, how's the water? The fish will say, what's water?
Yeah, right.
They don't see or recognize their own environment until they leave it. So by coming to Korea, you're not only learning a new culture, you're not only learning a new people, you're not only realizing the great diversity of life, of values, but you're also learning more about yourself, and you're learning more about your own culture and where you come from through that comparison. And I think that's also a marvelous thing, that if we have the opportunities, because 100 years ago, such opportunities were very few and far between. Right. It wasn't everybody that could get on a boat and travel to the other side of the world. And if you did, the conditions were very, very difficult. If you have the opportunity, I would encourage anybody to reach out and grab that, because of what it can do to your life.
Travel is so much easier now, and to be able to take advantage of that is a good thing. And my last question is something that you asked me, David, in our interview, which is, if you could ask my next guest any questions about culture and teaching, what might it be?
Very good. This is the bit where you edit my contemplative thought. The question is a two-part question, and it's a little bit sensitive, and that's why I want to ask it to somebody else. The first part is this: we currently see in North America and certain parts of Western Europe the rise of a certain type of culture that requires incredible sensitivity towards cultural appropriation, towards gender representation, towards LGBT, towards trans issues. How do you see this playing out in the decades to come? Are we living through a transformative moment that is just taking its time to embed itself into mainstream culture, or is it something that will remain a touch point of political division in which elites divide people to gain control, or is it something that will fade away? How do you see these issues playing out in the next decades? Will it fully embed and we'll all accept it, like we've done with things like slavery and racism? We're trying to embed those. Will it remain on the fringes in a touchstone, or will it pass away? And the second part of that question is, when people travel to other parts of the world, and cultural appropriation isn't a thing here in Korea. If you come, you'll be encouraged to wear hanboks and do the dances and the singing. How do we navigate when two cultures see these things differently? Like, where does the power lie, and is it a form of sort of cultural imperialism to require the rest of the world to do as you do, or do we allow differences? And where is the line? Is cultural relativism a thing? Or are there some things that are, no, these are just universal and they apply to every 8 billion humans on the planet?
Wow, such an important question.
Can I finish with this question, Paul?
Yeah.
Can men and women be friends?
But are you including that as a question to ask to the next guest? Or
No,
you're asking me?
just to ask you as a person. I'm just curious to ask you.
Yeah, I say yes. Is my response. Yes is my response. Yeah. But I know in Korean society, that's a very popular question asked among young people, especially, right?
Thank you for your honesty.
Yeah,
Very interesting.
Thank you for listening to the Cross-Cultural Psych Podcast with Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim. We hope this content was meaningful. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to write a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also, let us know what you'd like to see covered in future episodes. We hope you will join us next time.